Many people, especially I think Christians, struggle with the concept of time and how we measure it now. We live in a 24-hour generation that measures everything in seconds, minutes, and hours. But when you read older documents, especially scripture, you don't find minutes and seconds, or even really hours often. If you see the word hour, it's usually a kind of plenary term. This is the hour of something throughout the day, the hour of harvest. This is something where it's considered a metaphor of this is a moment of something. Because, of course, we didn't even have mechanical clocks that could measure down to the second until the Middle Ages. Um, the legend is that monks developed those mechanical clocks to tell them when they should pray because they would be cloistered in various enclaves away from the sun, and they would be doing things like grinding grain, or they would be doing things like stomping grapes, or whatever it was that they were doing that was out of sight of the sun or away from the sundial that was traditionally used to measure the progress of a day by the sun's movement. And so they would need to be told when to pray. And but for prior to that, it didn't matter. You rose when the sun rose. You went to sleep when the sun set. And if you did stay up, it was by a candlelight's flame. And so if you couldn't afford oil or beeswax to fuel that flame, or simply you were trying to live more frugally, you went to sleep when it got dark. You didn't have any choices about this. And so when you look at time throughout most of history, it's measured in days, in seasons, and in years. That's why you see a lot of agricultural metaphors, I think, in Scripture, because it would measure things in those seasons and years, in that if you planted an olive grove today, you wouldn't be able to harvest any usable fruit from any of those olive trees for about 7 years. If you planted a grape vineyard, you would have to wait 7 years before you would get a useful harvest of grapes. But that didn't mean that you just didn't do anything for the next 7 years. You still had to cultivate it. You still had to cull those non-usable fruits off of the vines. You would still have to trim, and you would still have to rid the patches of weeds, and you'd still have to keep predators and vermin out of the groves. Like, you would still have to do a tremendous amount of work, and you would have to do that work hoping that this plant is going to give you what you need. And then if you're planning to sell it as a wine, not only do you have to wait 7 years, but you also have to put that fruit into the barrels, and then it would have to be crushed, and then you would have to put the juice into barrels, and then you'd have to wait for it to ferment, potentially a year or more, waiting on that. And so that means you're talking about, you could have to deal 10 years of work just to get one barrel of the product you're planning on utilizing or selling. And if you want vinegar, if you're in this thing because you're going to make vinegar, you got to wait for that wine to go bad. So you're talking about potentially 20 years before you have real bartering exchange material. How many of us would be willing to wait that long? How many of us would be willing to put in the amount of work necessary in order for that to profit. Because quite frankly, many of us, if the link won't load in the first 5 seconds after we've tapped it, we forget it. I'm done. I'm not even. A few seconds and we're tired. Things like TikTok, the internet have gotten our attention spans down to 30 seconds or less, a minute or less, 3 minutes or less. We don't have the kind of perseverance and the kind of fortitude to sit and wait and see how a season is really going. We make decisions on how we feel today and in this moment of today, rather than making decisions based on where we plan to be 10, 15, 20 years down the road. It's one of the reasons why debt is so out of control. It's one of the reasons why inflation is so out of control. It's one of the reasons why the economy as a whole is so fragile. It's because we live in such instant gratification centered societies. But what if we didn't? What if we prioritized what Scripture prioritized instead? The seasonality of life. And what if we judged things based on the existence of those seasons instead? And trusted God that He's holding us in this season. He'll be holding us in the next season as well. But also listened to God. Ask God, what season am I in right now? Not just that it's the winter, but am I in a winter season? Am I in a spring season? Right now, I have an 18-month-old. Her life is very much in its spring season, right? Very little experience on her behalf. And we're having to learn how to live together in that season. And that means it's difficult. That means it's frustrating, right? She obviously doesn't have the ability to communicate yet. Sometimes, and we're having to learn to live the way that anyone would have to learn to live in that season, cherishing it for what it is, and also looking forwards, making decisions on her behalf she doesn't necessarily like, because we know that that's what's going to be good for her in the future seasons she's about to live in. It's not always easy. But we're about to head into 2023. This year's basically over. What season are you in right now? How do you even know what season you're in? Maybe begin asking God to reveal to you what season are you in, so that you can make decisions that honor the season that you're in. Cherish it for what it is, so that also you can prepare in the season for what comes next. Because if you don't keep the beds clear in the seeding phase, you're going to have a whole lot of difficulty when it comes to the cultivation season. And if you don't keep things clean and you aren't watering on a regular basis, etc., during the cultivation phase, then the harvest is not going to be what you want it to be. You've got to do this season's work in this season. And the only way you're going to be able to do that is if you recognize the season that you're in. Planning for the seasons that are in the future. And trusting God with the uncontrollable circumstances of both. You can't make it rain, but you can prepare your fields to receive the rain. You can't make the wind blow, but you can prepare your fields for a blowing wind. You can't make the season change. The season will change on its own. You can only make sure that you are ready for the season as it changes.